Hello, everyone. You're welcome to today's Museum Talk. We are very sorry for the late. We had a bit of connection issues, but here we are right now, ready to start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. It's a wonderful afternoon here at the Royal Museum for Central Africa. A warm welcome to all of you online participants, the presenters, and the team that has made sure that this day is a success. Feel free to say hello to us in the chat. Tell us where you're joining us from. I invite you to do that. Otherwise, my name is Mercy. I'm a PhD student and I'll be your host for today. I hope that you can stay with us as we reflect and exchange on this timely, very interesting but complex topic, decolonizing nature, in the next hour. The same topic, I should say, has been explored by a group of students with different education backgrounds from the KU Leuven over the past 8 months. And the learnings from this team will actually be shared in what we've called a Decolonise Nature event, a weekend, which starts tomorrow until Saturday evening here at the Africa Museum. You are all invited to come join us if you're in Belgium. For more information, you can check the chat for the website and details of this event. Back to today's activity, we are honored to be joined by two presenters who are academicians but also interested in different dimensions of knowledge, and not only the structured academic views and discourses, but also indigenous practices and ways of knowing and doing. We have Dr. Anywar Godwin from Makerere University, Department of Plant Sciences, Microbiology, and Biotechnology, with a huge interest in ethnobotany and indigenous knowledge. On the other hand, we also have Dr. Njabulo Chipangura, who is an anthropologist and currently working as a curator of living cultures at the University of Manchester Museum. His interests lie in decolonization of museum practices in Africa by undoing earlier ways of knowledge production and representation. The chat, there is a chat tab, but also a question tab on your screens. Please write your questions in the question tab, and we shall respond to as many as time allows. Otherwise, the presenters can also respond to the questions that are left out later and the responses sent to you over mail. Well, enough of me. Let's get straight into the day's presentations, and I'll hand over the floor to the first presenter today, Dr. Njabulo, who will share with us how community museums in Zimbabwe are representing indigenous knowledge and practices. Over to you, Dr. Njabulo.
Thank you very much, Missy. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending from wherever you're joining us from. My name is Njabulo Chipangura, as what Missy rightly said. I'm working at the Manchester Museum, which is under the University of Manchester in the UK. I'm a curator of living cultures, curator of anthropology, so is to say, but this position has been changed to curator of living cultures as a form of trying to decolonize the discipline of archaeology and anthropology, and as a way of trying to involve people in objects collections that we have at Manchester Museum, which were collected as a result of mostly colonial violence and the process of the expansion of the British Empire to different parts of the world. So today I'm going to speak about community museums in Zimbabwe. Apparently, before I was appointed curator of living cultures at Manchester Museum last year, I worked as a curator of archaeology for the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe for almost 10 years. So this paper comes from my work that I did when I was still in Zimbabwe and the kind of engagement that I had with a particular community that formed its own museum as a result of being excluded from the national narratives of museum making in Zimbabwe. And it's just an anecdote. Museums in Zimbabwe, just like in most parts of Africa, they were formed as a result of colonial expansion and they are byproducts of colonization. So the collection practices were structured around Western forms of knowing and Western forms of knowledge production for a very long time, and communities were excluded from the narrative or the story for a museum. So for a long time, these people were not involved in museum making and they felt marginalized. And that's how community museums were essentially formed in Zimbabwe. It was more like a counter narrative of being excluded in the national narrative. So the museum that I'm going to speak about was formed by the communities for a purpose of representing their own living cultures. So I'm going to share with you my slide, and then we can I can have a discussion around the slide as we move on. Okay, I hope you can all see the slide. So the title of the presentation is Community Museums in Zimbabwe as an alternative form of representing indigenous ontologies or indigenous ways of knowledge. So this talk comes from my work, as I indicated, that I did some work at Makerere Museum. So the name of the museum that I worked with was called Marange. The museum is located approximately 65 kilometers southwest of Mutare. So this museum was opened in 2013 as a cultural museum that contains and displays a variety of traditional artifacts and regalias that relate to the Marange chieftainship. The museum was started off using local resources by the community with a view of recording and presenting their contemporary cultural practices, which are specific to the Marange area. So this is a picture of this community museum. And what I want to underscore from the onset is that this museum is not a typical kind of big, huge museum building that you'd find in cities or in urban areas. So this is more or less like a rural community museum, which came about as a result of communities feeling excluded from the narratives of the national institution or the national museums. So the nearest museum, which is a national museum, where I used to work myself, is about 65 kilometers away from this small little museum. So for me, I think the idea about decolonizing not only nature but also culture also speaks to the idea that people can for themselves initiate ideas that can make them preserve and present their own cultural uh, practices outside the dictates of national institutions or authorized institutions. That's what happened in the case of Marange. So, what I was saying, the Marange Community Museum is an alternative form of cultural representation in the sense that its formation represents an active and emergent cultural transformation by indigenous people in the making and adapting as well as revising Western museological ways of doing things or Western museological frameworks that are still embedded in national museums in Zimbabwe. So by doing this, we are saying community museums, by nature, in the case of Marange Museum, they are providing a more inclusive participatory model for communities, which is absent in the setup of national museums. So for a long time, as I alluded to earlier on, um, museums in Africa, in Zimbabwe particularly, they are byproducts of colonization, and the colonial footprint is still very visible in a whole lot of ways. So by doing this, the community museum is sort of like coming in as an alternative form of cultural representation. Um, so why community museums? Perhaps that's a big question. Community museums can provide a more inclusive, participatory model for source communities, which is absent in the setup of national museums. So communities can participate freely. And in this example, it's just a museum formed by the community for the community by themselves by their own means and their own methodologies. They wanted to present and preserve their cultural traditions. And by doing this, it's part of uh, transmitting their heritage from one generation to the other in their own ways or in their own indigenous ways of knowing. Indigenous knowledge systems are at the heart of the formation of this community museum. So in another sense, in another sense, I read community museums as a form of contact zones. So since community museums are more inclusive in nature, they can be regarded as contact zones. And this is taken from a text by James Clifford, who argues that museums by themselves, they can be seen as spaces where debates and dialogue around cultural practices can be undertaken in a free environment where these debates can open museums as spaces for change or as agents for change. So in community museums, the idea is not so much about just presenting the object as a physical entity, but it's also on the stories that the objects can tell or can relate to living cultures of certain communities. And this is fundamentally absent from what you see in setups of national museums in Africa. The obsession is about monumentality, the physical heritage. This object, the aesthetically beautiful and pleasing object, is at the heart of conservation and care. But the stories around the making or the social biography of the object is, in most cases, is usually excluded from the narrative. So a community museum blends both the aspect of presenting and preserving the physical fabric of the material culture, as well as the intangibility or the story behind why and how the object was formed. And this form part of the whole social biography or social fabric of the object or the collection. So indigenous curatorship is at the heart of the formation of Marange Community Museum. So the formation of Marange Community Museum is grounded within the concept of indigenous curatorship, which reflects the work that is being undertaken by indigenous people, in which Western museological practices are being altered to suit community needs. Indigenous curatorship also prioritizes, as I said, social biographies and social histories of collections. And the collections can have a contemporary meaning as well as an ongoing dialogue with the community. So such collections are not regarded as static or as immobile. They are living collections because they represent ancestors and living cultures of contemporary people. So they are not disconnected whatsoever with the living people. They make sure that the collections speak to different kinds of ritual and spiritual activities that the people undertake in the society. So that's part of redefining the biography of an object in a museum, which community museums are doing very well vis-a-vis national museums on the other side of town, as I'm doing this comparison with the Mutare Museum, which is an institutional museum that is run by government and is a byproduct of colonization. So what can we say about decolonial museum practices in regard to the example of the Marange Community Museum? So the establishment of Marange Community Museum exemplify a decolonizing practice which, which provide a pathway beyond the limitation of national museums by losing specific local ideas. So community museums have stepped in to give priority to social aspects and are providing a meeting place where living cultural identities of particular communities are being revitalized. So the living component keeps on coming back because in this sense we're talking about the value of an object just beyond being a tangible object. But the value of an object also is to recognize and acknowledge that these objects are living beings. They don't die because they're imprisoned in dioramas or in storage rooms of museums. They are there opening the shelves and people can have an interaction with them as part of living cultures. And that's a different ontology altogether if you compare how national museums, in particular Mutare Museum, does its exhibition where people are not even allowed to come and touch objects. There's a very distinct differentiation between the role of an expert curator who takes care of a collection and the knowledge that they have, which are enshrined within Western epistemologies. But in this case, indigenous ontologies are used because objects are recognized as part of a living being and as part of an ongoing relationship between people and things. So objects and people, subjects and objects, they have a relationship in a broad spectrum. So Marange Community Museum, let me just run through the exhibition that we see at Marange Community Museum. So over and above being a traditional repository of living cultures and living heritage, the Marange Museum has managed to come up with some exhibitions that depicts the day-to-day activities of the Marange community and their living cultures in exhibitions. So there are about 6 exhibitions at the museum. So the first exhibition hall is called the Wonder Room. So the Wonder Room elaborates and celebrates the traditional rituals that are associated with the coronation of Marange chiefs both in the past and the present. So this room documents the process by which chiefs, traditional chiefs, are coronated, and this has been historicized from the past and also transcends into how these processes are being undertaken into to the present. So this is what we see in the Wonder Room, pictorial depictions of Marange chiefs historically from the past and how they were coronated, and those that were coronated in the present. So we also have different regalia and different objects that are used as part of this process of coronating a chief, and the different kind of traditional way that they have as chiefs. So this somewhat is an exhibition that documents the process by which chieftainship is done and is transmitted from one family to the other within the Marange community. And then we have what we call the faith room. So the faith room documents or historicizes the history of African churches that are found in Marange. So the reason why this exhibition was done was to try to celebrate African traditional churches that were formed before colonization. So there are different churches that you see here, and the different regalias of the churches. So it's a celebration of churches that are in Marange that were formed or that predates the establishment of Western ways of Christianity and Western ways of religion. So before that, the community had its own way of worshiping, and this is documented and presented in the faith room. And then we've got what we call the entertainment hall. So the entertainment hall is an exhibition which showcases contemporary Zimbabwean musicians whose music has had an impact on the community and on the country at large. So they're selected popular Zimbabwean musicians that are displayed within this exhibition, or including this late famous Zimbabwean musician called Oliver Mtukudzi. And then we've got the crafts gallery. So the crafts gallery showcases handmade artifacts that exemplifies technical abilities of Marange communities, both in the past and the present. So these objects include woven baskets, mats, mortar, pestle, pottery, and wooden bowls. So this is the crafts gallery. And one of the most interesting aspects about this gallery is that these objects that are on display are also up for sale. So it's an interesting dynamic to me, because in a normal museum, objects don't go for sale, right? Objects are supposed to be kept there for eternity, and they're preserved in glass cases and so forth. So, but in this example of this museum, in this community museum, they acknowledge that these objects are part of their living cultures. So putting them on display also allows them to sell them, because they can easily replenish them as they make new objects in the community. So these crafts are presented in the museum, yes. But if visitors come to the museum, they want to buy any of these pieces, they're allowed to buy, and then they can be replaced immediately. This shows a bit of continuity in practice in such kind of technical abilities of making and remaking crafts for a contemporary community museum like Marange. So the next exhibition is called The Heart of Rituals. So the Heart of Rituals depicts the burial processes associated with the burials of chiefs or Marange chiefs. So objects that are used during the burial processes are depicted and showcased in the Heart of Rituals. So we have this reed mat. So this is a reed mat that was used for the burial of a chief. So when a chief died, or up to now, when a chief died, they are not buried in a normal conventional coffin. They are draped in this reed mat, and then they are taken away to the mountains where they are buried in a secluded area. And in most cases, only the elderly people of the community, the elderly aged people, are allowed to attend the ceremony, the burial ceremony. It's a secretive, very secretive event, which is only undertaken by elderly people. And the chief is buried in a cave in a mountain. And this is more or less like a coffin of some sort. So they drape the mummified body of the chief into this draped into this reed mat, and then they carry with it to a secluded location for his burial. So this is depicted again in the museum. And then we have the inheritance hut. So the inheritance hut illustrates the process by which objects of a deceased chief distributed amongst his immediate family members. So inside this hut, there's a very huge traditional drum called Ngoma Ngendura, which is belted out to announce the death of a king or a chief. So when a chief dies, the community is not told immediately. So the announcement is only done after 2 weeks. When the chief dies, it's only those in the inner circle who would know that the chief has died. But after 2 weeks, the announcement is done through this very huge drum. So there's a drum beat that they do, and the community would actually know from the sound of the drum that this is announcing the death of a chief, right, of their chief, and then they'll congregate at this chief's homestead to mourn the chief. So this is the drum, part of the drum that is there in the exhibition, which is used to announce the death of a chief. And this is only done after, as I said, after 2 weeks. This is a secretive, very secretive ritual. The death of a king, of a chief, is not just announced there and there for some traditional cultural reasons. So, wow. So, what are we saying after having spoken through these exhibitions? How can we read Marange Museum as part of a decolonial, as part of an empirical way in which decolonization in museums can be approached? What is to decolonize a museum, and how can we approach decoloniality in an African setup? So the recent emergence of community museums in Africa can be regarded in a whole lot of ways as a decolonial methodology that is being embraced by local people in response to exclusion from national narratives in national museums. So this view is supported by Ruben Boos, 2011, who argues that due to frustrations with the engagements with existing national museums and the complete insignificance of national museums to the community, indigenous people are creating their own centers of collecting, performance, and representation. So a community museum can be read in light of what Ruben Boos argues as a deliberate exclusion of people from museum narratives, right, as a result of colonization. So now communities are coming up with their own initiatives to form their own centers of cultural collection and cultural representation in the form of community museums. And this in itself, to me, I read it as a form of a decolonial methodology in decolonizing the colonial footprint of national museums in Zimbabwe. So community museums vis-a-vis national museums. Community museums are very different from national museums because they are managed and developed by communities to represent and safeguard their own heritage. And at the same time, they can also be used as spaces for dialogue, right, that addresses different kind of social and contemporary challenges, which we don't find normally in national museum setups. So, indigenous curatorship in Marange Museum entails that indigenous structures of knowledge, ontologies, and forms of knowledge are incorporated in the ways in which objects are represented by embracing both the physicality of the object and social biography of the object. The life history of an object is really prioritized within the production of narratives in community museum, as in the case of Marange Museum. Thus, indigenous curatorship is different from scientific ethos used in national museums because it takes not only an interest in objects as things, but also in the people, their beliefs, and what forms of meanings are derived from the spiritual beliefs and the ritual activities that the objects are used for or were used for before they were dislocated from their original context and placed in the museum. So there's a connection between tangibility and intangibility. So, what is a decolonized museum practice? So, decolonizing museum curating involves decoding museum collections from the colonial meanings in which they have been cut off, displayed, decontextualized from where they once belonged, and in which they have been categorized, labeled, and transposed into alien binaries of Western hierarchical knowledge systems and deconstructing the colonial footprint by which the museum was formed. So it's breaking the barriers, the categories, the categorizations in museums. The disciplines are broken down, and we have a form of shared authority in the production of narratives in museums, or co-production or co-curatorship, as per se. So that's part of what decolonizing can entail in an empirical way, breaking those boundaries of collections and breaking those Western ways of knowing and knowledge systems by incorporating indigenous ontologies. So collaborative practices are at the heart of decolonizing the museum. So decolonizing practices are collaborative in nature, which means when an idea of a project is initiated or is conceived, it should be in conversation with responsible source communities or diaspora communities. And for the Marange Museum, I think the museum was formed as a result of this kind of dialoguing and this kind of representation of cultures by communities who felt that they have been excluded from the national narrative. So collaborations ensures that communities are not considered as passive audiences for authoritative forms of knowledge production, but they're implicated in ongoing processes of knowledge production as active co-producers or co-collaborators. So in this sense, I think the concept of a co-curatorship is very essential when you start talking about decolonial practices and collaborations. So I read from Wayne Modest and Viv Golding, who argue that co-curatorship entails taking interest not only in objects as things, but also in people, the changing practices and belief systems that lend them meaning. So co-curatorship prioritizes social history and the collecting of contemporary cultures in a dialogue with the community. And then another way, we also speak about the ideas of curatopia as a future of the curatorial practice in which decoloniality can be read as an important step of museum making. So curatopia explores the ways in which mutual asymmetrical relations underpinning global scientific entanglement of the past can be transformed into more reciprocal, symmetrical forms of knowledge production and curatorship in the present. Curatopia as a concept looks at the emerging active reciprocal relationship between indigenous people and museums. Quite. So what are we saying in conclusion? I've spoken about Marange Community Museum and what I view or regard as the making of the museum using indigenous ontologies, which is at the heart of decolonizing the museum practice in Africa. And I've compared Marange Museum with a national museum in Mutare, which is structured, authoritarian, and uses Western discourses or knowledge systems to present and document this collection. But on the other side of having said everything, decolonization as a practice in a museum setup has its own kind of downsides, which we need to acknowledge. Yes, it's a very good thing to think about and to have a conversation with, but it's not really the ultimate solution to making the museum space as accessible as possible. So even when we speak about decolonization, the question still comes back to the power geographies, right? We're collaborating with communities to remake exhibitions, but where does the power exist? Who is at the center of power? So I read from Ruben Boost again, who argues that no matter how much you think about democratizing knowledge production in museums through collaboration, the intellectual control will still remain vested in the hands of a curator. So curators still retain a significant amount of power in all of these collaborative practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Njabulo, for the wonderful presentation and interesting examples. I was planning to ask already what decolonization means to you, and you have touched upon this quite very well. I like the fact that the community is not waiting for anyone and they are starting up, their own initiatives to come up with alternative forms of representing their own ideas, which I think is quite interesting. I'm not going to waste time. We have quite a number of questions. I will hand it over straight to our second speaker today, Dr. Anywar Godwin from Makerere University, and he's going to be reflecting, or telling us about how indigenous traditional knowledge is applied in healing practices. And the floor is yours, Dr. Anywar. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mercy, for that kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to take a little bit of a digression. My presentation is going to be more from my experiences and coupled with a few studies here and there. So I would like to share with you the other ways of knowing in line with indigenous traditional knowledge and healing practices, specifically with medicinal plants. Now, I would like to start from the basics. I'm aware that the audience is quite diverse and we may not be at par. When one talks of decolonization, for example, what does it mean? The first thing that would come to mind when someone mentions decolonization is typically the withdrawal of political, military, and government rule over a colonized territory. And of late, we have been hearing a lot about decolonizing education, which is basically the process in which we rethink, reframe, and reconstruct curricula, research, and other endeavors that keep in perpetuity the colonial ideas. It should not be mistaken, however, for diversification, because even within the colonial context, we still have Western bias. And this process of decolonization actually goes much deeper, much further than challenging institutional hierarchy, the monopoly of knowledge, and moving away from the Western framework. So the reason I'm bringing in education here is that it touches on very many aspects of our lives, like I'll be showing in a little while. So this cannot go on without us talking about epistemology in African philosophy. And it's very often that we encounter the word epistemology, which is basically the way in which we come to know, understand, and view the world. So this process is continuous. It goes on through our entire life, and it is influenced or affected by our environment, both formal and informal. Some of the main players include the state, religion, very huge influence, especially in areas that have been colonized, the law, families, neighborhoods, and public opinion. So this epistemology includes the African concepts of nature and knowledge, the way in which knowledge is gained and even transmitted. We also talk about the ways in which we can justify an epistemic claim or validate a knowledge claim. And this whole knowledge that plays out within the human existence. So the Western philosophy, which has been ingrained in the way we live, in the way we do our things, tends to look at life from a singular perspective. When looking at healing, the Western view tends to dominate and looks at things from the scientific perspective. So when something does not neatly fit within the scientific perspective, when it does not conform to the rules of science, we tend to either ignore it or discard it, and we are going to look at a few examples to demonstrate this. Going back to herbal medicine, which has been transmitted over the centuries, continuously changes, and especially in the developing world, the majority of the population, some estimates by the World Health Organization have put it at over 80% of the population relying on herbal medicine to meet their healthcare needs. So this is a huge percentage, and we are well aware that there is a move. People are moving away from conventional medicines. People are trying to go natural, even within the developed world. So there are several ways, I argue, through which this knowledge on healing is acquired in traditional societies. And we have seen that in Africa, it is mainly transmitted orally. And this oral transmission is mainly done through song, through poems, riddles, through rituals, there's a common practice of storytelling over the fireplace, through which a lot of knowledge, a lot of information is transmitted to the younger generation. Unfortunately, this practice is dying out because of school. We no longer have children sit by the fireplace because they come back late, they are doing homework, and they are simply not interested. However, this landscape is slowly changing. From the various studies we have been conducting, we are seeing more and more of the traditional healers, even when not educated, using their children or are employing some close relatives to help in documenting this knowledge. So some are keeping catalogs of the different medicinal plants and herbal medicines they use. And this is a good thing in a way, because it helps in preserving this knowledge. So I'll share some examples here, but one of the peculiar ones we keep finding is the acquisition of herbal medicines through dreams and visions. So through various studies, we interact with herbalists who tell you that they acquired knowledge on the use of certain plant species, either through a vision or through a dream. And in the dream, they got clear instructions on which plant to use, on where to find it, on how to prepare it, and how to administer it. We see this over and over again, and because it is difficult to verify, it does not neatly fit into the conventional or the other systems which we are comfortable with, which we are familiar with. So we tend to disregard this or to ignore it. Another practice is that by those we call traditional bond setters. Now, the images I'm sharing here show traditional splinters used by traditional bond setters for repairing bonds that are broken. One peculiar thing that we also encounter is the claim by different herbalists to different bond setters to actually be able to treat. Let's say someone has a fracture and it's going to involve some bit of bone manipulation and massage. There are some specialists that are able to do this remotely without being with you physically. So you are given an appointment, you are given a time. They'll say, for example, at such and such a time, you sit outside your hut, sit on a mat or a backcloth, or they give some particular instructions which are meant to follow. Then, without being with them, those that have witnessed this tell you that you'll notice the person whose bonds are being manipulated wincing in pain, because it feels like someone is actually touching them and manipulating these bonds. And this goes on without the herbalist, the bond setter being physically there, and with time, the bonds eventually heal. So this practice, we have actually interacted with people who have been healed through this practice, but because it does not fit within the prescribed colonized notion of doing things, it is also disregarded and not taken seriously. Some herbalists also, in a way, carry out trials on animals. They'll give different plant extracts or preparations to animals. There are plant species we know are both toxic and medicinal, depending on the dose used. They have what one may call a narrow therapeutic window. So should the therapeutic dose be exceeded even by a small amount, this can be fatal. So one of the plant species used for managing hypertension here is called Rauvolfia vomitaria. That's the botanical name. Now, when used in high concentrations, it induces vomiting and it can actually be toxic. So I have known of herbalists who manipulate the dose by, giving it to animals and observing and trying to see what happens. Then, I also want to share about what has been called the doctrine of signatures or doctrine of similarities by different scholars. And what this doctrine basically says is that there has been some divine providence by God to show us different plant species or different plants that resemble certain organs, body organs. And that in a way shows us which plant can treat a particular condition. I'm going to demonstrate this a little later on, but in one of our studies where we interacted with herbalists specializing in treating snake bites, snake envenomation, there was this one particular plant called Apilia amentaceae, whose image is on my right, where you see the cursor. Now, one or two interesting things we found about this plant is that if you zoom in on the stem, a mature stem, it has a scaly-like appearance. It kind of looks like a snake in a way, the skin of a snake. So this particular herbalist told us that he got a revelation about the use of this plant in managing snake bites by simply looking at the root and the stem. And because of its appearance, its resemblance to a snake, he decided to try it out. And it actually, according to him, was working. And he's a renowned healer in the area in which he resides. He's visited by throngs of people to manage snake bites, especially by poisonous snakes. So this doctrine of signatures attributes the therapeutic properties of plants to particular morphological features or features they possess. That's why some scholars have called it the doctrine of similarities, because like treats like. The other interesting thing about this particular plant is that studies have shown that it is also used in India. Remember, this is Uganda we are talking about. Now, a separate independent study has shown this same plant to be used for managing snake bite in India. So we find this very interesting, and the doctrine of signatures, like we have shown, we are going to see, is not taken as a scientific approach. It has been disregarded by many, and it has barely yielded, according to some scientists, any productive leads towards the discovery of medicinal plants or drugs from medicinal plants, rather. So just to demonstrate the doctrine of signatures a little further, I'll use something a little bit more dramatic here, which may be familiar to different members of the audience, especially those from Europe, where walnuts grow. Now, you can see there's a resemblance in appearance of the walnut and the human brain. This is a very vivid demonstration of the doctrine of signatures, and accordingly, the walnut should be able to help in some conditions, some mental conditions or some neurological conditions, according to folklore, even in Europe and America. And recent studies have actually demonstrated that walnuts are high in omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, which are actually considered brain food. They are critical to the normal functioning of the brain, and these may help in counteracting oxidative stress and inflammation, which have been implicated in cognitive decline in many of these diseases. So here we see a link. It could be an exception rather than the rule, but there are some links or there are some connections in some of the plant species which have been used in this doctrine of signatures. Back home here, other examples include some medicinal plants which breastfeeding mothers take because they produce some kind of milky sap. So it is believed that if you are breastfeeding and you're not producing enough milk, and you chew or use leaves from these plants which produce a lot of sap, they actually stimulate milk production. So the link has been drawn between the milk, the breast milk, and the actual sap that is produced by breastfeeding mothers. There are several examples. I'll not delve much into the details here, but over here we have eyebright, a plant called eyebright in Europe, and because of its resemblance to the eye, it was used for treating different eye conditions. If you look at the eye down here and the structure of the flower, there is a bit of similarity. And this plant is actually very popular for different eye conditions. And then we have mandrake here. This is how the plant looks like. And when uprooted, it has a resemblance of a human torso. So it was traditionally used for treating various conditions, and scientifically it has been proven to contain different compounds which are very powerful. They belong to a class of compounds from plants which are very powerful, produce very powerful effects on the body. Then over here is a variety of what we call clay tablets. They are basically different herbs that have been mixed with clay and molded to form into different shapes and sizes, okay? Now these clay tablets are used by people suffering from different conditions. They are popular, they are common among pregnant women, and they put different herbs which allegedly play different roles, they do different things. And this actually shows, this actually came before the advent of colonialism. Before colonialism came, we already had our own version of tablets. So what are the threats to these ways of knowing, these other ways of knowing that are not mainstream? I've talked about acculturation already. People are losing their cultures. One study by the Language Institute actually shows that of the 7,000 languages that are spoken globally, about 41% are under threat of extinction, and we know how powerful language is. It's a very powerful medium of transmission of this knowledge. And within 100 years, it's actually estimated that goods comes with its own challenges, religion, westernization. With westernization, we have people abandoning some of the marginalized, and they are considered primitive or backward. And yes, I would like to, in conclusion, I would like to borrow from what the previous speaker actually shared, that decolonization should be looked at in context. It is not a panacea to the problems we are having now, but we have to look at ways of harmonizing and learning from each other, because knowledge does not exist in a silo. Knowledge is organic, and we have continuous growth and outflow and inflow of knowledge in different communities, different societies. So I am of the view that one, we should not disregard or throw out these other ways of knowing completely. However, some people may look at them or undermine them as being backward or unscientific and the like. We should be very careful not to throw away the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. There's a lot that this knowledge holds that we do not know, and we need careful, conscious studies to understand the dynamics of this knowledge and borrow from other systems of knowledge so that we can preserve, we can improve, we can preserve, we can document these practices for posterity. So before I part, I want to also share one experience we're having with different partners in Uganda, the Uganda Museum, and I've seen some representatives here. I'm very happy they have been able to join. The Uganda Museum, there's the Gongo Cultural Museum, and partners from museum in Switzerland. We're trying to see how we can build some kind of living museum to preserve the traditional knowledge surrounding the use of different medicinal plant species. So we're planning on having a living collection with some of this knowledge documented so that the public can learn from it. They can learn about the different ways of knowing. And we believe this can help in stimulating learning and ensuring that we do not lose the knowledge we have. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anwar, for that enormous presentation. I think we all agree that we've come to like what I would call a converging discussion here, where we're saying that indigenous traditional knowledge has been disregarded, not taken seriously in the current times, especially because of the current practices and changes going on. But I would like to we have so many questions in the chat. I hope we can answer most of your questions. And thank you so much, participants, for the questions. And bear with us a few more minutes, just so we can answer as many as we could. But I'd like to start the question session myself with a more general question to all of you, since we all agree that traditional practices, ontologies, ways of knowing have been disregarded, we cannot blame the current systems, but what can we do to change the narrative? How can we harmonize indigenous and academic or Western knowledge? Do you have could you give recommendations of how institutions like Njabulo, the museum, how can museums start, this process of decolonization? And then you are being a lecturer at a university, what would you recommend to start the process of, including other narratives to your classrooms? For instance, I had a botany class when I did my undergraduate studies. We didn't have all these scientific names, all these traditional names in our class. We only had scientific names. What do you think would be a step to start including, these indigenous practices, ways of knowing in the class for you, Godwin, and for Njabulo? What steps could, for instance, the Africa Museum in Belgium take if they would like to start a decolonization process? Any one of you can start the questions.
All right. Merci.
Okay,
So for me, I think, as I said in my presentation, I think the essential thing is for museum to democratize knowledge production systems. So how do we do this? Shared authority. right? In knowledge production is very important. And we're speaking about knowledge production in a museum. We're speaking about activities like exhibitions. How do we make museum exhibition? By co-production. Co-production involves bringing those people who were previously marginalized from museum making to become not only participants, because the word participant really makes me sick, because a participant is someone who's just consulted in brackets. So we need to collaborate. Collaboration brings more power to the people. I'm a curator, I'm an expert, I'm an archaeologist, I'm an anthropologist, but I don't know everything, right? So why can't I just bring those local or source communities to the museum, work with them, reconfigure objects that we have at Manchester Museum that were appropriated and came to Manchester as a result of colonial violence. So museums themselves are colonial productions, and they still uphold a lot of colonial ways of doing things and ways of knowledge production. So museums in Africa, yes, in Europe, we need to start thinking about how do you co-produce exhibitions, right, in museums that collaborates, sorry, with source community and indigenous people. So I play around with three very important concepts: shared authority with living communities, co-curatorship with living community, co-production and collaborations can be used as methodologies to decolonize the museum, whether in Africa or in Europe.
Anwar, could you unmute your microphone if you're speaking?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that approach. And in addition to co-creatorship, co-ownership, co-creatorship, from the university perspective, we have to continuously engage engage our students, reflect, look at the way we teach. One of the things we often do with our undergrad students is that when they come, we send them back to their local communities, and we try and engage them, try and stimulate their minds by asking them to, go and come back with information, engage their parents, the elders in the villages, try and come back with information on the different systems of healing, and this gets them thinking. So we have to have a change of mindset, because by the time they enter university, they have been going through an education system that has sidelined or marginalized these non-conventional ways of doing things. And yet we have seen their inherent value. There is a lot they carry. So we try and send them back. We try and engage them so that they can begin picking up these bits and pieces of information. Once that consciousness is created and they become aware of what is happening around them, the change can begin happening. It's a slow process, it's a gradual process, but it has to begin somewhere. And the classroom, for me, is a great way to start. Of course, with my children at home, I also do this. Whenever I get opportunities to speak to younger people, I take advantage of this. The project I talked about that we are trying to engage in with our partners involves these living collections, so that when people come to the museum, they are able to see, these medicinal plant species that they have probably never seen before. And there could be one or two demonstration centers. So people are seeing how these plants are harvested, how they are prepared, how they are administered, and they get to learn. And this, gives them confidence that the traditional knowledge they had or they were shunning away from actually has a lot to offer.
Thank you both. Okay, I see we run out of time, but I'll ask a question to each presenter from the audience. At least that's the best we can do before we close it. And I'll start with Njabulo. There's a comment here. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering, given your current experience and work in the UK, do you think the community museum concept could also work well in the European context? Or are there examples of it already being applied? This is something we've been discussing. When you talk about decolonization, people immediately think Africa, Peru, Brazil, global South, but actually even the global North needs some kind of decolonization. So I think this question is very interesting. Do you think the same concept of community museums could work well in the European context? Unmute, Njabulo. Sorry.
Sorry, Mrs. So I was saying, yes, decolonization is an ongoing process. As what anyway said, there's no panacea, there's no silver bullet of what decolonization is. It's a group of practices. So for the European Museum, instead of imposing the community museum on an already established body of museums, what we can do to decolonize is to collaborate with diaspora or source communities in the remaking of exhibitions in European museums. I think you can agree with me. There's this famous concept called Museum of World Cultures, Museum of World Cultures in Europe, right? This is a new concept of trying to say, okay, we have these collections from Africa, from the Pacific, from the Oceania. They represent universal humanity. Is that so? And there are questions around repatriation, restitution of cultural objects to where they came from. That's decolonization, right? But how many European museums are willing to walk the talk? Empirically, how do you decolonize a museum? There are many claims of indigenous people that want to get back their collections that were appropriated violently during colonization. And they found places in European museums and all these other museums in the global north. So how do we do it? Unconditional restoration, repatriation, sorry, unconditional. Museums can say for themselves, okay, this is what we have from Nigeria, this is what we have from Senegal, from Zimbabwe, from Uganda. We want to return. But how can they do this? That's part of decolonization. So for me, there are different ways of approaching how the concept of a community museums can be replicated in Europe. I don't think so. The communities have to be collaborated in European museums. They have to be there. They have to be part of the new exhibition making, right? They have to be involved. There are source communities, there are diaspora communities in Manchester that have a relationship with the Benin Bronze that were looted from Nigeria during the 1897 expedition of the British troops. So why can't we speak with them and make them have a voice on this Benin Bronze without even talking about repatriation, but just involving them in the remaking of the narrative? Because most of these questions that we have, they're just stagnant. They just stay in the storerooms, but they don't tell a story. So how can we make them tell a story? Bring back people who know how these collections were used in ritual or spiritual practices. I can go on and on, Messi, because I've got so much about this debate, but I'll end it.
Thank you, Njabulo. Indeed, this discussion will cannot end in 1 hour, as you can see already. It's us trying to pack everything. But I'll go straight to the question to Anwar. And it says here, I see that you're using plant names following the Linnaeus nomenclature. Do you think scientific plant names should or could be decolonized? And if so, how could that be done?
Thank you for the question. Very pertinent indeed. Yeah, the reason I use the scientific names is part of the colonization process, and in a way they are universal. And we say that, of course, there could be some merits. There are certain things we could pick. We may not throw everything away. The traditional names actually speak volumes. They are things I didn't share because of time. But from the traditional names of medicinal plant species here in Uganda, there is a lot we learn about what the plants do. There's a plant that is very popular. It is actually proven scientifically to be very effective in treating prostate cancer. The scientific name is Prunus africana. But if you go back to the local name, the locals use intercessor in Luganda, it actually talks or it speaks about one of the main symptoms experienced by people suffering from this condition, from prostate cancer or enlargement of the prostate gland. So even before modern science came, the names of some plants were already speaking to the uses of these plants. And one of the ways we can decolonize is by, emphasizing or going back to some of these names. What do they mean? How do they come about? They tell us a lot. That is just one example I've used, but there are lots of medicinal plants whose names actually tell us what they do. So if I'm keen on language, even without knowing what a plant does, and you tell me the name, I can guess and I can have a conjecture on what that plant possibly does. So I think it's very important to emphasize the local names of these plant species when studying about their scientific names, especially to those communities where those studying about these plants may lie. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very wonderful responses. We are a little over time, but I will ask maybe the speakers for today to give us like closing remarks or one or two things that you'd like the audience today to go with. If they forget everything that has been said today, what do you think they should not forget really regarding the discussion around, marginalized knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems? I was very keen to Anwa's presentation because myself, I have a biology background, and I should say it's a big shame that I know most of the scientific names, but if you ask me the local names, I would go like, oh, I'm not so sure. And this is something we are trying to say, hey, it's if we continue like this, it might not be good in years to come, because indeed, like you say, there might be some insights in indigenous knowledge that could be useful, especially for the challenges we are facing right now as a world. Yeah. So losing it and throwing it in the drain might not play out in favor for us or even for the next generations. So to conclude, what would be your take-home remarks towards this discussion? What do you think? Do you think we should end the discussion? Because it's a difficult discussion, I should tell you. There are people who feel like once you start talking about decolonization, oh, no, 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 I don't want to be involved in this discussion. Or even some people already start, defending and saying, no, we've already been doing this. I'd like to borrow the words of Anne, and she's here. Anne Snake, thank you for being here. She says she's calling upon people like you, Njabulo, in the museum, and Anwar in academia, to kind of have a bifocal lens, to look at things with two lenses, and not only the scientific names, for instance, but also the local names. But let me just end it here and ask each of you to give like a concluding remark. What would you like the audience today not to forget? If they forgot everything that has been said here today, what should they not forget in regards to this discussion?
Well, from my parent, I would say I'm going to underscore the fact that decolonization is a process. It's not a one-day event. But I think starting a conversation around how to decolonize is the most important thing, whether in a university or in a museum. All these two are knowledge production centered. Museums will produce knowledge derived from interpreting material cultures. Right? So decolonizing, we're not going to end today because of this discussion. I think there is need for us to have ongoing conversations. But what I want to underscore again is the fact that Epistemologically, all of us have been talking about decolonization, but empirically, how do we do it? So for me, I think we need to emphasize the empiricism perspective of decolonizing. And in a museum environment, part of empirically practicing decolonizations through collaborating, co-curatorship, and bringing back marginalized voices into a museum space and sharing authority towards the production of exhibitions and other museum practices.
Thank you. Anwar? Um,
Yes, as we speak about decolonization, we have to remember that the process of colonization was deep rooted. It took hundreds of years. So the process we are trying to engage in is very complex. It is very dynamic, and we cannot, like Njabulo has said, it cannot be a one-off. And we should look at it with very open minds. And we should also know that there is no one size fits all. There is not one way of doing it. There are different ways of doing it. And we can go at it bit by bit, piece by piece. The most important thing is to get the conversation started and to always be aware, to always have it at the back of our minds that whatever is going on around us, there is a process of decolonization that must begin. And decolonization, remember, colonization or colonialism affected all spheres of our lives. There was nothing that was left untouched. So talking decolonization means all aspects of our lives. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I take this as an encouragement for instance, the Decolonise Nature student group, that people shouldn't be frustrated and stop at the end somewhere, and they're like, oh, it's not happening. It's never going to happen. It's indeed a process that might take some time, but if we continue following through the path, it will eventually come through. And yeah, but I'm very grateful that you joined here today. Thank you for all the participants. There's so many questions. We shall respond to the questions. The speakers will respond to the questions, and we will email you responses possibly later. But also, you can rewatch the session. It will be posted online. Details about this shall be shared. But I would like to end the session here and thank you all for being part of it. Thank you to the speakers. A big, big thank you for making time to be here and sharing with us your experiences. And I end by welcoming all those who are in Belgium to come and we continue this discussion tomorrow and Saturday. It's going to be like a continuation of this kind of discussion at the museum here. I'm excited because I know if we talk about it, possibly that is the very first stage, like Njabulo says. And it's good that we can, have a space here at the Africa Museum, which could be like, if you like to take it as like a center of colonial, if you like. But it's also interesting that the Africa Museum opens its doors to these discussions, so they're not shunning away and closing and like, oh no, we don't talk about complex things. But it's also a sign, and we appreciate this sign, that people have open minds and they are willing to start discussions like this. I'd like to end the session here. Thank you all for coming, all the people who have attended, from New Zealand to Belgium to Uganda, from Netherlands. Thank you all for being here. Until the next museum talk, I've been Masi, together with Njabulo and Anwar on today's museum talk. Bye bye.
Bye bye.